Thank you. We've got a pretty special session. This is, I think, one that's going to be extraordinarily important given how timely it is as well. The two people that I'm going to be introducing, and then there'll be a couple more brought up to the stage afterwards, but the two I'll be introducing are Lisa Woll and Commissioner Robert Jackson. The privilege of doing this is to really be able to let you see two, I think, real icons in the sustainability space and the capital market space. Two of the people who, in my view, have the potential to influence SRI investing generally, capital markets, and a lot of other things beyond the capabilities of most other people. In part, one, because of the sheer energy and the perseverance and the organizational capability and the stamina that Lisa Woll has brought to her position, and then because of the actual government position and the ability to vote that Commissioner Jackson has with regard to his position. So let me give you a quick bio on both. We'll start with Commissioner Jackson. Commissioner Jackson was sworn into the SEC just this year, January 11th, 2018. So I think he is one of the newest commissioners around. I tried to trace the lineage of when I was on the commission all the way through to Commissioner Jackson, and unfortunately there's a gap in between where it's hard to tell exactly who followed who. So, but I'm going to assume that you're taking my seat. So, and we'll go from there. He is, among other things, and now obviously a commissioner, but before that he was a legal scholar. He was also a corporate lawyer. He is a professor, I guess, on leave from NYU at the moment, and had also been at Columbia. He is the co-filer of the petition to the SEC on corporate political expenditure disclosure, which I guess was made in 2011, which to date has received more than 1 million comments. In addition, having read a number of his speeches, I can tell you that they range from a whole variety of things, whether it's capital market structure, whether or not it's IPO pricing, whether or not it's political expenditures, or other kinds of things. So it reflects a very broad interest in our capital markets and in trying to make the capital markets a better place. So it's I think, indicative of a very keen mind and a very broad swath of interest. So I think you're going to find it very interesting. He's going to be interviewed for the first 15 minutes or so by Lisa Woll. Lisa is the CEO of USSIF, the Forum for Sustainable Responsible Investment. You'll hear more with regard to the USSIF report later this evening. She's held that position for 12 years, and in that position has really taken USSIF to the sort of high level that it is today, doing so many really important things. In addition to sort of leading that, and I think at this point most people would view USSIF as the leading voice for advancing SRI across all asset classes, Lisa also herself was personally named to the 20 most influential people in ESG investing by Barron's. In 2018, she also received the Impact Award at the Forbes Women's Summit. So it's pretty powerful stuff. She has a favorite saying. I've been asked to say what it is, and it is, don't agonize, organize. So without further agony, we will organize the rest of this panel, and I will introduce and leave it at this point to Lisa. You're going to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody to our 5 o'clock session on a Friday. What better time to talk about public policy? And I'm really delighted to be here. I want to just give you a sense of how this is going to work, and then we'll start. So Rob and I are going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then I'll be inviting Lisa Gilbert and Jonas Kron to the stage, and the four of us have a conversation. And we are leaving a space at the end for questions because we think you'll have them. And what a great opportunity to talk to our great panelists. And so if you do have questions as we go along, jot them down so you don't forget. So I'm really excited to talk today with SEC Commissioner Rob Jackson. I just want to kind of bookend my comments before I start with the real questions, which is been at this job, as Steve said, for about 12 years. I've met with every SEC chair, dozens of commissioners, Republican and Democrats. And not once did I ever leave one of those meetings and say I had fun. Not once. And then Rob Jackson came to the SEC. And Brian McGannon, our policy director, and I went to our first meeting with him, and it was just like energy, 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 energy. And we're still having fun, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And so that's awesome. And then Rob spoke at our conference in May, and he got off the stage, and he had groupies. He had people clustered around him for so long taking selfies with him that I had to interrupt to escort him out because the staff said he had to be back at an important meeting. So I think this is like a new thing for an SEC commissioner, Rob. So, you got a lot to live up to here. So let's start with talking a little bit about your career and how you got to the SEC and whether you envisioned a career as an SEC commissioner.
Oh, no, never. So first of all, let me just say how thrilled I am to be here, how grateful I am to be introduced by someone with such deep connections to the commission that I'm now serving, and of course to have a conversation with you about these important issues. I think the introduction was absolutely right. This is really the leader in so many of the important issues we're going to discuss, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity. I was never a guy who thought I'd end up anywhere like the SEC. I was born in the Bronx to an Irish Catholic family. My mother's one of 9, my father's one of 5. I have 97 first cousins. And I'm about to get married, so a guest list is tricky. Good thing I'm at the SEC. I'm going to get used to drawing arbitrary lines. I never imagined I'd be in a job like this, honestly, man. And the thing about my family to know is my mother and father were never really thinking about anything like this for me. Their thing was, they thought if they put their paycheck away on every week or every other week and plowed it into the stock market, someday, like the big dream was that I might go to college. And it was because of the great people at the SEC, including those who are here tonight, who that created a stable market that really shared growth with middle-class families like mine, that I even got to go to college. And by the way, at the time, my aunts and uncles laughed at my mom and dad. They didn't think I'd ever even go to college. And the idea that I would be sitting a few months ago at a Senate confirmation hearing with my mom and dad sitting beside me was beyond even their wildest fantasies. I never imagined I'd be in a job like this. And there's 2 things to know about me because of that. First of all, I think every day about trying to make sure that we create markets that allow somebody to have the kind of experience in life I did. I walk into the SEC every day living the American dream. And I worry that people feel like that's no longer possible. And I think about that every day. And second, because I've already had a Senate confirmation hearing with my mom and dad behind me, I'm playing with house money. So I'm happy to take some chances because it's all upside for me from here.
Thank you. So what are the most important things this audience needs to understand about the role of the SEC and how it functions, or maybe doesn't, on behalf of investors?
So first of all, the thing to know about the SEC is, and this is really true, it's full of extraordinary public servants who are trying to do the right thing. And it's hard to know what it is. And in a moment like this in our nation's history, where I know all of us feel a great deal of moral clarity, the thing to know is that there's a lot of people in that building who are trying very hard to get it right. And that's true with respect to the enforcement of the law, with respect to the rules that we make, and the rest. Now, here's what I'll say. Fundamentally, a problem with our securities laws over the last 10 or 20 years is that it's been governed by a group of securities lawyers who fundamentally are conservative. And I mean that in a small c sense. I mean that in the sense that they tend to let the market take the lead and follow, rather than the reverse. And that's why events like this, your work, and these conversations are so important. Because what we have done in the past, for better or for worse, is demand that the market show us the way. Now, I'm not sure that's the right way for the SEC to work, but it's the way it works today, and that's why everything we're talking about at this important conference is so important.
Talk a little bit between the way the SEC sees investors, its investor audience, and its corporate audience, non-investor corporate audience.
Yeah. Well, one good example of this is the way we think about materiality at the SEC. So if you hear any SEC lawyer talk about the things that we require to be disclosed or the things they don't, the magic word is materiality. This is the bedrock keystone proposition of the federal securities laws. And I agree, it's been the law for a long time that something has to be important, or in securities parlance material, to be disclosed. But the question is, how do we know what's material? And one important thing to know is that the securities bar is full of folks who are sure they know the difference between what's important to investors and what isn't. And they've got all kinds of strong views about what's material or not, and by the way, it tends to have to do with their politics, Certain people think guns are really important, other people less so. Certain people think political spending is very important, other people less so. My view here is to let investors tell me what's important, because it's their money, not mine. And I lack the hubris to think I know what's on their mind. Instead, I try to ask them. So one way you can do that is to see what the subject is of shareholder proposals, what investors are talking about, what they're trying to get in front of the company and its board of directors. Another thing you could do is see how the stock market behaves. When, for example, companies fail to put forward sustainable business plans or fail to respond to ESG concerns that come from investors. And that's one problem at the SEC at the moment, that we've sort of come to the view that we know what's important, when instead we really should be asking investors that question.
Okay. So one of your first public speeches was about dual-class shares. Talk a little bit about why this issue is important to you and whether you see that getting traction with your colleagues.
Yeah, well, I'm actually excited about this. So for those of you who don't know about the way dual-class structures work, increasingly it's the case that U.S. public companies, when they go public, have a provision in their charter that says that the company's founders get to hold special shares that have many more votes than everybody else. So this is true of Facebook, Google, you name it. If it's a big, recently public company, they've probably got dual class. And in a speech I said, I should say, by the way, investors have been complaining about this for years, saying, we want to hold management accountable, and we can't do that when they have 100 votes for every one that we have. And what some investors have proposed is that there be limits on the use of these structures. And in a speech I gave just when I joined the commission, what I said was, here's what troubles me about this. Fundamentally, the idea that the founders can have control for some time, that makes sense to me. But the idea that they can have it forever, the idea that, for example, Zuckerberg's kids and their kids' kids should inherit that company, that strikes me as fundamentally at odds with the ethos of the country. I called it corporate royalty. I said it doesn't make sense that there's a special class of manager that gets to control these important companies that, for example, in the case of Facebook, have a lot to do with our our civic discourse. My view is we fought a war about royalty like 200 years ago, and the good guys won. So I said, my perspective was that we should do something about it. And here's the point I'll leave you with about that. Increasingly, because investors are so upset about it, the stock indexes have been leaving out companies with dual class. So the S&P 500, for example, has said that if you're a newly public company and you've got this structure, you can't be in the S&P 500. And I said this is the wrong way to handle this. And the reason is most ordinary mom and pop investors participate in our stock markets and indices. And if we think as a nation that we already have a problem of haves and have-nots, capitalism that doesn't include everybody, imagine what it will look like if in 20 years the next big American growth story wasn't in the portfolio of middle-class Americans who bought the indexes. That's not the way to solve this problem. No, instead, we should put limits on dual-class structures that don't allow intergenerational transfers of power. And that's what I've been arguing for.
Okay, thank you. So the SEC is an independent agency. Maybe you can explain that for a minute, what that means. And I wonder if you think the upcoming election could have an impact on the commission's agenda or how it works.
So it's a really important question. A couple things. So first of all, independence means a lot of things for these purposes. But most important thing is that the president, by law, it's understood that he cannot fire SEC commissioners except for cause. I think. I'm pretty sure. Not testing that hypothesis. So that's what independence means. But look, anybody who's ever been at the SEC, including former colleagues, will tell you that doesn't mean that we don't care about what the Congress thinks, not at all. There are a number of ways in which the agency is accountable to the Congress. First of all, they appropriate our budget. And second of all, the Senate must confirm any commissioners. And third, the committees that they run oversee our work very, very carefully. So I think having a Democratic House would be enormously important in advancing a lot of the debates we're having. And just to give you one example, the conversation we just had about dual class, that's a conversation that could be had in a hearing in front of a Democratic House. I think it's a hearing that's unlikely to happen in a Republican House. So I'm hopeful that if we have a different party control in the House in the spring, we'll have a very different experience as an agency. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean that we will change our course or do things differently. What it means is we'll have a different public conversation about what the securities laws should do for the nation, and I think that's very important.
Right. At this point, I want to invite Lisa and Jonas to come up. And while they're coming up, I'll just give you very brief bios of them both. Lisa Gilbert is Public Citizens Vice President of Legislative Affairs and served as the Deputy Director and then Director of Public Citizens Congress Watch. And Jonas is the Senior Vice President and Trillium's Director of Shareholder Advocacy, but most importantly, he's a member of the USIF Board and co-chair of USIF's Policy Committee. So welcome. Thank you both for joining us up here. And so to all of you, just really rapid fire responses. Later this month, the SEC is holding a staff roundtable on shareholder rights, proxy advisor regulation, and proxy plumbing. What do you think will come out of the roundtable, and should this audience be worried? Jonas, you're gonna be there.
Okay, so I guess a couple things for folks to know about that. I think, you know, certainly it's worthwhile being concerned and being worried, given that we've seen things as the Choice Act coming in front of us. But a lot of the traffic right now out there, if you're just sort of looking at the chatter and looking at what the reports are from the Business Roundtable and Chamber of Commerce, there's a lot of attention right now being paid to the proxy advisors. They seem to be getting the most fire right now, which isn't to say the shareholder proposals aren't. We definitely are getting a lot of attention. And what they're describing, what the Chamber of Commerce is describing, is they make it sound very scary. They're talking about zombies, and that's actually the word that they use. Zombie shareholder proposals are out there wandering the corporate wasteland and making trouble. But I think we're going to be finding out that there's not a lot of data to support that. We are looking at this very closely. Actually, the LA pension plan just recently put in their comment letter, and they made, I think, a very important point. Of all the votes that they cast in 2017, only 2% were shareholder proposals. So if there are zombies out there, they're very small zombies. And that even in that case, you know, they're talking about these very sort of narrow political shareholder proposals that they're complaining about. But a narrow political shareholder proposal, it isn't going to get 3%, 6%, 10% vote anyways. Those shareholder proposals are going to get excluded in the normal course. And then the notion that there are these zombies, these shareholder proposals that are sort of clogging up the works, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, sitting around in the teens or the 20s, there's really no data to support that. You know, the number of times that that's actually occurred in the last 10 years, you could count it on your fingers and toes, assuming you're not a zombie and you've lost your fingers and toes.
Right. Good.
But basically, yeah, that's the situation.
Lisa, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, and appreciate the carrying of the zombie metaphor throughout.
I think he just likes saying zombie.
So just flagging a little bit for framing. So Public Citizen, we're a membership organization. We have 500,000 citizens around the country that we represent. So our perspective on investor issues is usually thinking about retail investors, what the regular public wants. So this process, this proxy roundtable, we see it as both a possible opportunity, but also a potential threat, as we do every time issues open up around disclosure or the shareholder process, things that regular investors, regular Americans are paying a lot of attention to, similar to the SK process that we went through, or even the disclosure effectiveness review process with the prior chair. If we weigh in, if we say the right things, if we push for ESG disclosure and we seize on the roundtable, maybe something good will come out of it. But there are a lot of threats out there that Jonas was alluding to. Certainly there are big corporate actors who are pushing on the other side of the equation, so there's also a threat that something bad, either rulemaking or guidance, will come from it.
And Rob, it's always a question for me when you have a roundtable, the notion is towards what purpose, right? So what might happen after a roundtable, and then for folks in this room who aren't at the table, there's going to be a relatively small group of folks speaking and then a broader group of people who can watch. What's the best way for them to engage in the process around the roundtable?
So a couple of things. First of all, I agree with everything that's been said by my colleagues. I think it's a crucial moment for those of you who care about shareholder participation in corporate democracy. I think, first of all, in terms of what will come out of it, there are basic fixes to the shareholder voting process that need to happen. And I'm glad to say that most of the roundtable is dedicated to that, rather than, say, things like proxy advisors or 14A8 and related questions. So that's very important. But second, I think that you're right. That there are folks out there who are pushing very hard for more regulation of proxy advisors or less corporate responsiveness to shareholder proposals. You know, the thing I've said about this to the chairman, and I found him to be open to these kinds of arguments. I kind of said, of all the issues that could be in our agenda, of all the things that plague corporate America, the idea that we have too much accountability doesn't seem to me to be at the top of our list, but That's just me. Here's what I'd say to all of you. Write in, watch the roundtable, participate in this process, because I couldn't agree more with the idea that the things we hear are going to shape our agenda for the next 2 years, from this election to the next. And if you want to be heard during that process, you're entitled to be. And reach out, write letters, or attend the roundtable itself, and make sure your voices are heard.
Right, okay. So staying on sort of policy issues at the SEC, Public Citizen worked with US CIF, investors and academics and others to submit a petition on broad required ESG disclosure to the SEC last month. And as you know, we had submitted a proposal almost 10 years ago now for broad ESG disclosure. We got a couple of pieces of disclosure as part of the Dodd-Frank Act, much of which got contested at the SEC, but a few of them actually became law. And there is opportunity, as you just mentioned, Lisa, for comments on Regulation SK, where there was a broad question about should there be ESG disclosure, and if so, on what? And the comments back to the SEC were overwhelmingly positive about more ESG disclosure, and then that administration ended. And so I think had we had about 6 months more of a run ramp after the deadline on SK, we might have gotten some action. But now we have a petition back to the SEC, and I'm wondering, Lisa, what is the call to action on that for this room? And Rob, how has that been received at the SEC, and does it have legs? Lisa, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, the call to action is very straightforward, which is exactly what you were just saying, weigh in. One of the reasons that we decided to do this petition, and so many were interested in it so quickly, is because every time a petition on some form of disclosure has come in over the last several years, there's been a massive outpouring of support. The 1.2 million supporters of the political spending disclosure petition, for example. So we wanted to band together all the different strands of disclosure, be it climate or tax reporting or human capital or political, and call for it in unison and just make the case in as loud a way as we could that this was the time and it shouldn't be ignored anymore. And so in order to make that case, we need everyone in the room to write in and comment and say that yet again in this new forum.
So first of all, I can't tell you how important this petition is. In terms of its receipt at the commission, I'd say that people are interested to hear what follows the petition. And whatever one thinks of the political spending petition, the fact that there was such an outpouring of support, I think put it front and center at the agenda. And I think it's really important that that happened with the ESG petition. Moreover, I think I just want to add that the ESG petition itself is extremely well written, but it's broad. It encompasses a lot of potential subjects. And so the idea that folks can write in and suggest, for example, we might prioritize this or that. We might focus on this part of the disclosure regime. That would also, I think, be useful in terms of focusing the commission on the potential to move that petition forward.
And is there anything that we in this room who are concerned about ESG disclosure should be doing at this time to kind of, you know, as you were involved in the political contributions and disclosure on that and the million letters, and we haven't gotten that yet either, but should they be hearing from a broader group around this disclosure petition?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't say how important that is. And whatever is the subject that you're thinking about in that area, I mean, you should feel, it's not as if you have to write, there's no magic words. You don't have to write a particular thing. You can write it to me if you want. Believe me, I'll pass it along. Seriously, I'm not kidding. Oh, just so you have it, by the way, my email is jacksonro@sec.gov. If you have, seriously, jacksonro@sec.gov. If you have a hard time getting it in, just bounce it to me and I'll send it to them. Don't do it to Jackson R, though, because that guy's a paralegal in New York and he's getting pissed off. So, but I really mean it. Write in, make your voice heard. You all are the leaders on this issue. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're participating in this process shows that you're the people that petition is written for. So make sure your voices are heard on it.
Thank you. And so, Lisa and Jonas, I'm wondering what you think could happen in Congress as a result of the midterms. We do have this election happening on Tuesday, and you know, none of us can prognosticate about this, and I always seem to end up on this stage immediately after an election or immediately before an election. And so I'm not sure what that's all about, but I guess in 2 years maybe I'll be on the stage again talking about the election. But what do you think might happen as a result of the election? Do you have a sense of the House and the Senate? And then what might we be able to do to drive forward concerns of the sustainable investment field as a result of what you think might happen with the election. Jonas, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I guess if Nate Silver of 538 is to be believed, the Democrats have about an 85% chance of taking the House, and about the same on the other side. The Senate, the Republicans have about an 85% chance of holding on to the Senate. So if you sort of operate from that basic point of view, I don't know that from our point of view, that very much will get done. Maybe a couple of places that there's some public policy opportunities that our community would be interested in. In climate change, there's something called the Kigali Amendment, which is actually up for Senate approval right now. And without going into the details, if the Kigali Amendment actually goes into force across the globe, that could account for 1/2 degree of warming that would be avoided. It actually can make a really big difference. And the industry is actually supporting it right now because they're happy to phase out the HFCs and sell you some new HFOs. And so there's a real business opportunity for them in that. But I actually think that what we need to be thinking about a little bit more is what's going to be happening at the state level. There are a lot of governor's races that are opportunities for climate-friendly governors or gubernatorial candidates to be coming into office, really across the country. And if that happens, we're going to have a lot more states that are going to be in position to set renewable energy targets, to be encouraging companies to be purchasing renewable power, to be setting transportation policy. So I think looking right now to the governorships and to the state legislatures and even some of the state initiatives right now. So I know that we're all sort of thinking about what's happening in Washington, but I think we need to really pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the states right now.
So let me just ask you a follow-up question because I know you both just got, well, in fact, all of you, all the panelists just got here in the last couple hours, but we've had 2 extremely sobering presentations on climate change. Thank you, George, for depressing the hell out of the entire room, not once, but twice. But I don't think this is surprising to anyone. I mean, we know that climate is a crisis. We've known that for a long time. What would happen if we got the House and the Senate? What would happen if the House and the Senate both became Democratic? Do you think we'd be able to move some kind of climate legislation and start changing the trajectory?
Well, we would still have Donald Trump.
Yes.
So, I think, it certainly would change things. And I think if nothing else, Donald Trump likes to win. And so there may be some opportunities there. But I think it's still going to be, extremely difficult to be getting any legislation through until there's actually Democratic leadership throughout the presidency and both houses. I think that's really the reality and why I think it's important for us to be looking at the states.
And Lisa, talk a little bit about sort of some of the other kinds of legislation we might be able to see moving a little bit, or some of the issues we might be able to move for the Congress if even one House changes, or maybe even what we just might be able to stop from happening.
Right. So we focus at Public Citizen primarily on the federal level, so we are all thinking a lot right now about what might happen, and I think it's right to say that the House is quite likely to flip and the Senate less so. The question is really by what margin. There are about 100 competitive races right now, but it's hard to, you could probably circle around 15 where we're sure that they're going to flip. So it could be sort of feast or famine, a huge insurgence of Democrats or just winning by a little bit. And so that's going to dictate in a big way how bold the House is willing to be and what they're willing to do with their time. The other dynamic is the leadership fight that's happening, so we don't know whether it will be Speaker Pelosi or not. And so that will change the dynamics a lot in terms of what is being put forward. But for the purposes of prognostication, assuming that the House flips and the Senate doesn't, and we have the same leadership team, we can actually make a pretty good guess as to what they're going to be prioritizing first. They've been talking about it quite a bit, and it mirrors what they've been campaigning on as well. So they have a For the People agenda, which has 3 buckets in it. The first one is anti-corruption. This is incredibly important and resonating across the country right now, no matter what part of government people look at, whether it's Congress or the administration or the judiciary, they're seeing corruption and they want to fix it. And they also think it's kind of a pox on both houses, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. They don't believe that anything else can get done unless government is fixed. And so Democrats see that writing on the wall. The polling is really clear. And so they've decided that the very first thing that they do if they take the House back is a pro-democracy package. So that's what I'm expecting to be maybe even H.R. 1, the very first bill, a big messaging bill on democracy reform, talking money in politics reform, voting rights, and ethics issues. The second bucket that they're likely to tackle is jobs and infrastructure in the economy. It's obviously something, those pocketbook issues are things that really resonate, are incredibly important, and set the stage. And then the third thing that we know that they want to tackle is healthcare, but particularly prescription drug price reform. So I think we will see those things as message bills, but big packages very early if the House flips. And that is something that we can do. I think in talking about what it means for just the House to flip, it's not unimportant for them to put huge message bills forward that set the stage for 2020, that set the stage for the next time the Senate is up, really infuse narratives out there. So we'll be looking at those message bills, also the hearings that they can hold, and then lastly, their tool of oversight. We've had 2 years of this administration just running willy-nilly and rolling back rulemakings that are important to all of us. So speaking of the environment, I know there will be a good hard look in the Energy and Commerce Committee and other places as well at what it means that rules have been rolled back on clean cars, on air quality, and more. We'll probably also see a look at why executive compensation rulemakings haven't moved forward, just taking a look at all of these flaws in this administration, and that oversight tool and judicious use of the subpoena is really powerful and important.
So I want to say all those things are true and important, and I know this is about a sort of a political look ahead, but I want to just be clear also that I think what I'm hearing right now in the community and in boardrooms is that all of you and both of you and you have moved corporate boards in a place where they really want to take steps in this area. I think we've gone from a place where a board gets a shareholder proposal or engagement from investors, and they used to sort of call a corporate law firm and get ready to fight, et cetera. I think more and more they're willing to be responsive to fundamental questions about, do you have a sustainable business model, and if not, why not? Not because it's so important to have a sustainable business model for the future of the planet and our society, but also because it's a fundamental business competence question, whether or not your business can be sustainable for a significant period of time. So I think that conversation has really changed in the boardroom. So all of these things that will happen on Capitol Hill will be enormously important, but so will things that happen in corporate boardrooms. And those are things that can happen right away, starting in the spring proxy season, and I hope that they will.
So let me push you on that a little bit, because I've had the opportunity twice in the last 6 months to see Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, speak. And for those of you who've seen him speak, how many other CEOs speak like him? Pretty much none. Maybe 2 or 3 on a really great day. Talking about business being part of the social contract, talking about businesses as being a way to move sort of social environmental progress forward. And I had a conversation with him when he spoke at the PRI conference, and I said to him, what would it take for investors like this room to change boards so much, right, that choosing a CEO like you is the default? It is not like an international exception. And he is an international exception at a broad level. So I hear what you're saying, but let's talk about, like, really, what would it take to change boards?
Well, so fundamentally, if you want to talk about the need for change in boards, it's not the CEO level is very important, but we can talk about another issue that's near and dear to my heart that I've talked about. I'm a member of the 30% Coalition, which says as its goal having 30% of board seats in American public companies held by women, we hope by 2030. To me, the idea that is the goal is by itself a problem. Right. Because the notion that we can't find more qualified women to sit in American boards is astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing. So the answer is we have a lot of work to do. But the point I want to make to all of you is that I've been in the boardroom conversation for a very long time, a decade or more. And I remember when those proposals used to come in, the default answer was, we fight. We use shareholder money to pay a law firm to get this excluded, to convince people not to vote for it, et cetera. And the conversation I'm hearing now a little bit more is, actually, maybe this is a relevant business question we need to be able to answer. Now, I would prefer, I think we'd do better if we had more diverse boards with different backgrounds and more expertise, especially in ESG-related issues, and we need to move that forward. But I think you're going to find in the coming year or two that boards are going to be a lot more responsive to those kinds of things. And that's why I think, in addition to the political activism that we need, we also really need to think about boardroom activism because it's making a difference.
Thank you. So I just want to take a real quick poll of the audience, because it leads into my next question. And so how many of you in 2018 have gone to meet with a legislator, state or federal, or with any regulator? Can you put up your hand? So this is actually, that's about, what do you say, 15%? Something like that? So, you know, at USIF, we do a lot of work on policy. We've tried to engage our members a lot in policy work. And we've tried to, we created a policy leaders program this year to get firms that historically have not been engaged in policy to let us train one of their staff members. And the quid pro quo is when they're done training them, they have to make policy part of their job. It was hard to get 4 or 5 people to apply for that. We hope that having them as ambassadors going forward will ratchet up participation. But it proved our point in a way, which is that there's a small number of firms that see policy, at least the kind of policy we work on, maybe not what the Chamber works on or the Business Roundtable works on, but the kind of policy that we work on is an essential part of what they do. And I know when we go up to Congress, most congressional staff, be they Republican or Democrat, are thrilled and interested to hear from business, and we are business, talking about environmental, social, and governance issues. And so, Rob, I'm just curious to know, you know, you've been there about a year, you know, who do you hear from the most? And is our community as on your doorstep as much as they should be?
No. Let me just say that, you know, one of the shocking things about being at the SEC for 9 or 10 months is, you know, you hear about lobbying and lobbyists and how that works, et cetera, and then you're in it, and man, are they good. I mean, it's astonishing. You can look at my calendar. I mean, every week, folks come in representing whatever their interest is, and they're very good at it. They have a clear playbook. They know what they want and how they can get it. They have relationships with the staff and the commissioners and on Capitol Hill, et cetera. And that's why organizing efforts, like, for example, the ESG petition or some of the other, there's many of the things you've done are so important, because I just want to let you know the other side is good at this, and we need to be too. We need to be having, I mean, there's no reason why all of you who are in this room who represent so many investors, so much that's important to our nation's future, shouldn't be having the ear of all 5 SEC commissioners and every member of the Congress. So I really can't urge you to, more to do that. And by the way, I want to also say that it makes a difference. In the day-to-day decision-making that we make, we have limited time, limited resources, and we create priorities. And one of the great things about having the relationships I do with folks in this community is that it allows this issue to be the priority it should be for me. And so I urge all of you to continue to push. You shouldn't be shy. You represent American investors, and you're entitled to be in that room.
Thank you.
Actually, Lisa, along those lines, can I just...
Yeah, go on. Jonas.
Just actually a question I have. If the Democrats take the House, Maxine Waters is going to be the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what that means for us, for our community, having a champion that will also be meeting with you and making those arguments.
Well, look, I certainly don't want to speak for some future House or committee, but I will say that Representative Waters has been extraordinary on these issues. She understands these issues extremely well. She's always prioritized them, and I think if I were in that position, I would be thinking very hard about what are the priorities going to be for that committee, and how do I get to the top of that list. I think Lisa's description of that is probably right, that there's going to be something about accountability across the political system, and that priority makes sense to me, but that's just one. And there's going to be a lot of HRs in a new House. And so thinking about not only HR 1, but 2, 3, 4, and also what those committee hearings will be, the way that that conversation will develop. I hope that's a conversation we're having right now, because we have a great opportunity to shape that debate in the new year.
And I'm sure you've been having conversation with her staff, as have we,
Yes.
just to sort of get a sense of what might come up.
Yep.
So
they're doing a series of listening sessions right now with stakeholders, so folks who are in DC or can get to DC should absolutely go meet with her team. They're thinking a lot about thematically what hearings should look like, how they can make a point over several hearings in a row, calling up the administration, and then proposing a policy that comes in the wake of that hearing after the point has been made. I think they're being very smart, and they're also coordinating well across committees, so that these themes of conflicts of interest or whatever they want to pull out can be hit across issue areas. We also had a discussion about making sure that all of the hearings have all of the commissioners invited, so that we don't just hear from Clayton over and over again, but we get a chance for Rob to be up there speaking as well.
we'll be supportive of you speaking there as well, for sure.
Always glad to be subpoenaed.
Yes. So we spoke a little bit about 14A8 and shareholder rights very briefly when we talked about the roundtable, but we do know the financial choice has passed the House. It was not very good provisions for engagement in shareholder issues, and it never went to the Senate, so we never had to face that as a congressional issue. There have been some conversations about whether the SEC might take up a sort of change in resubmission thresholds, original submission thresholds for 14A8. And we also know that the Business Roundtable several years ago put out a very, very bad proposal on shareholder rights, which I think they don't feel that great about now, but has not formally been changed at this point. And so I'm wondering from the congressional perspective and like from the SEC perspective, should we still be worried? Like, should we be worried about other things at night? Or is 14AA something that still feels that it could be in play in Congress and the SEC?
Well, the Choice Act, or we called it the Wrong Choice Act, was a huge non-starter. It got no Democrat votes. It couldn't make it to the Senate. So I'm not particularly worried about that vehicle rearing its head again. Even if the House doesn't flip, I think it's kind of had its moment. And it was so extreme. It had restructuring of the CFPB. It had the ability of the president to fire independent commissioners for not for cause. Made it impossible to unwind big banking behemoths that are failing. So lots of big things that I think won't come up again. Unfortunately, some of the shareholder issues might be seen by some as mildly more moderate. And so it is possible that smaller versions, pieces of the Choice Act do come up again, and it's seen as less of a non-starter. So I do think we need to be vigilant and paying attention.
Yeah, Senate House Bill 5756 from Congressman Duffy did get peeled off, and that would have changed the resubmission thresholds. It made it out of committee, I think actually maybe with a Democratic vote or two, which was unfortunate. But it never saw the light of day on the House floor, and so that died. And if I'm not mistaken, all these bills die at the end of the 115th Congress, and then everything has to start again at square one in the 116th.
So that all sounds right. I'd add two quick things. First of all, I think we'll learn more about 14A8 and the future of it at the roundtable. And this is another reason why engagement at this moment is so important, because you'll get a sense for what appetite there might be. Second, I think in the early part of this Congress, the overreach in the Choice Act was so astonishing. Like 1% threshold for submit.
Right.
Like you have to be long $7 billion in Google to submit a proposal. Like what? Like, I think everyone thought of that as sort of not a very sensible proposal. I think those ambitions, in response to that, those ambitions have been scaled back quite significantly. And so people are focused now on things like resubmission, somewhat more modest, but also a seemingly more reasonable set of goals. And so I think that's where the action is going to be and where people should be focused.
And I just want to throw in a little story just to give you an illustration of sort of what happens in Congress. So when the Choice Act passed, we went afterwards to meet with a Republican member of Congress's staff who was on what they call the social impact, I think that was the name of a task force in the House. And the social impact task force is to really figure out how can you use investors to make companies better on environmental and social issues. And I said, but your member just voted for the Choice Act, which makes it harder to bring the shareholder proposals to change the way companies operate. We don't know anything about that. And I don't think that is an exception. I think most members of Congress who vote on most legislation don't know that much about the specifics. So I'm fully of the belief that fully 50% of Congress doesn't know what a shareholder proposal is and wouldn't know what it was if you put a piece of paper in front of them. But what's important about that is how we can change some of the dynamics, because he said it wouldn't have mattered even if he understood that piece of the Choice Act, because it was going to be a party line vote. And so those are some of the things. I was fascinated when I walked out of that meeting, because it never was a discussion topic in that office, even though his boss was one of the few members of this task force. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Rob, the Division of Corporate Finance just released a new staff legal bulletin that discusses how it intends to respond to certain shareholder proposals on executive compensation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So should we be concerned about that?
So I should be careful not to comment too much on matters that are going to be before me. Oh, I always forget this. These are just my views, not the views of the other commissioners or the chairman or my mom or anybody else. Nobody cares. Although I like to add my caveat to the caveat, which is I have no doubt that in the fullness of time and wisdom, they're going to realize I was right all along. Recently they recently put out this bulletin on executive compensation where they talked about shareholder proposals on the subject. I'll be honest, I did have a careful look at that. I'm not very worried about it from the point of view of a community like this one. There are a few proposals in that area that they wanted to clarify, and I'm not especially worried about it. I think on shareholder proposals, there are two things I'm very focused on. First of all, making sure that the new staff legal bulletin from 2 years ago that requires boards to give explanations of their reasons why they want to exclude something doesn't become some kind of bizarre otherworld business judgment rule where the board gets to say we want to exclude something because we want to exclude it, and that's good enough. And I have to say, to give great credit to the chairman and to the Division of Corporation Finance, that's not what happened last year. A number of boards put in terrible explanations, and the Division of Corporation Finance said that's a terrible explanation, we're going to vote on this proposal. And that's why I want to say again that within the boardroom, the conversation is really important for you to make your case and say, here are reasons why we want to have a vote on this in the proxy, and if the board can't show that we're wrong, we're entitled to have a vote. I think that's where the action will be on shareholder proposals. And then just one more thing on executive compensation. There's really only one thing we should talk about, which is finishing the Dodd-Frank rules that we passed years ago. I mean, it is an astonishing.
It's hard to write those, right? Must be hard.
It's not that hard. I mean, 8 years. God.
And they were written.
Right.
And
They've been proposed. Look. Fundamentally, I've said this publicly before. I've said it to the chairman in private and public, so I'll say it again. It is a scandal that those rules aren't complete. First of all, it raises real, law. I mean, I hate to be the law professor about it, but they're Article 1, we're Article 2. First of all, it's the law. Moreover, the idea that of all the rules that didn't get finished, it's the ones that the executives get paid on, it's the ones that are in the executives' pockets. This is a horrendous appearance, a terrible message for us to send to American investors and the people of the United States. We have to finish those rules for the agency's credibility, and I hope that we will.
So Jonas, you were part of the brain trust that worked with USCIF for 8 years to change the ERISA guidance in the Department of Labor, both on ESG incorporation in investing and on shareholder rights. Earlier this year, there was a field assistance bulletin, which is another lower level of guidance for those of you who don't follow the terms of the Department of Labor that sought to clarify the ESG guidance put out by Tom Perez in 2015. It was met with some concern, but ultimately didn't seem much of a substantive change, more of a political statement of pressure. But do you agree that's been the impact of it, that it has not been seen as a substantive change, that it really hasn't chilled fiduciaries moving forward on that, or do you think it's still a problem? And what do you think we can do to move more more ESG assets into retirement plans?
So I guess on the first part, I would agree. I think there was a tonal change, and I think it was certainly discouraging, but it's sort of true to form in terms of the political football that ERISA has become on this issue, and so I think we saw that happen again. To the second part, in terms of how do we encourage more flow to these pension plans to do sustainable and responsible investing? I think I would think about it in sort of 3 different ways. The first is the thrift savings plan. So through some great work at USCIF, back in 2015, there was some discussion about opening up a window to create an option for a sustainable and responsible investing option for the federal employee retirement plan system, the thrift savings plan. That's $500 billion. That's 5 million participants in that process. I think we need to really encourage that to move forward and start getting these strategies onto those platforms. The trends report, I think, is also an important part of this. One of the things that we can do is we can demonstrate the efficacy of what we do, the power of what we do, the broad-based uptake that we're starting to see in what we do. And the Trends Report, which just came out last week, does an amazing job of demonstrating that. Now we're talking about $12 trillion in assets that are professionally managed, that are starting to look at these factors. That's 1 in 4 in the United States. So I think that's another important piece. The last one, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to the states, but given the state of things in Washington, I think we really do need to think about the states. State treasurers' offices are starting to look at this a lot more closely. There's been sort of that core group that we all know and love, New York City, New York State, California, but it's starting to grow more broadly. Oregon treasurer is starting to take an interest in this. Illinois, yesterday we heard from the treasurer of Chicago. My old colleague, Seth Magaziner, now the treasurer of Rhode Island. Pennsylvania, we're starting to see much more uptake from these treasurers, and I think we really need to stand behind them and support them as they start incorporating these issues into their investment process, and that will really press it out further into the pension systems.
So before we open for questions, just a real quick, starting with you, Jonas, any last thing you want to say as it relates to policy, Congress, and the SEC or Congress?
I think I would like to just sort of take a little bit of a step back and look a little bit farther out. And there's been some conversation about this already. As we looked at 2019 and 2020, there's a lot of talk about healthcare policy and climate policy and corruption and all of that. And I think it's really good, but there's also a lot more discussion out there about a set of first principles about democracy. And I think we need to think about this a lot more. I think we need to think about voter registration. I think we need to think about gerrymandering. I think we need to think about political campaign reform, which actually our community has been great on. We need to think about statehood for Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. I think there's a lot that needs to be done to create the democratic infrastructure so that we're not playing political football and we can actually move forward in a meaningful way on these issues. And that is sort of the piece that I think, we all want climate change legislation, and that's important, but we also need democratic reforms.
Thanks, Jonas. Lisa.
Well, I want to clap for that because that is exactly what I love to hear. So Public Citizen is very involved in this massive democracy package that we hope will come out early, which encapsulates all of those pieces. So would love this community to be more involved in that. I think whatever policy that the ESG, the SRI community focuses on, I think it's important to have a proactive agenda right now. So more than anything else, not just staying on the defensive because that's where we've been, but moving ahead and setting the stage for 2019, for 2020, trying to get message bills put out there and passed in the House that support the things that we stand for. So I think just however we can coalesce around that now, it'll make a big impact and is very important.
Thanks. Rob.
So I think that's right, and one of the things we all in this community can be thinking about is what does the alternative agenda look like in a different government? And that's one of the things that motivates me in the speeches that I give or don't give, the things I focus on. How would things be different in a very concrete way for ordinary investors in our world if there were a democratic government? I think it's important for us to make that agenda clear. And the other thing I'd say is one of the great things about coming to a community like this one is to get to hear from all of you. So really, we want to make sure we take some questions.
Absolutely. And USCIF is having we've pulled together a meeting for next week, I think on Thursday after the election. Lisa, I know you'll be on that, and others, to talk about what is the impact of this, what can we move together, what can't we with our broad coalition partners, and what should we be thinking about, because you're absolutely right, 2020 is not that far away. And regardless of what happens next week, we have a bigger agenda we need to be thinking about. So with that, we're going to open for questions. I think there's some roving mics. There's mics where? Both sides? Okay. So I'm going to ask you to ask a question, not make a statement, and to just ask one question, and to just tell us who you are and where you work, just so we know. So we need to get to the mics, so you can all go stand by the mics. There's one over there and one back there.
Oh, wow. Hi.
My turn?
I can't see.
I got here first.
Okay. Go on.
Hi, Kathy Mulvey with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thanks a lot for the discussion. The SEC was previously investigating ExxonMobil over how it reflected carbon risk in its project pricing Last week, the New York Attorney General filed a lawsuit against the company over misleading shareholders about climate risk. And I'm wondering what impact that action might have in terms of potentially the SEC being able to reopen its investigation, and what role congressional oversight might play in that?
It's a very good question, and I have to be a little, I always want to have a conversation, I have to be a little careful to talk about potential subjects of investigation because those come before me for a vote as a commissioner. Here's what I'll say. I heard all the things you did about this and was extremely concerned about the degree to which investors had the necessary information. And so one of the things I'm hoping to learn a little bit from is what happens in New York and what's uncovered. As I say, I can't talk about any particular investigation that might come before me. But this is what I meant earlier when I said how important these kinds of efforts are, even on a company-by-company basis. Because I can tell you, folks at the SEC, folks at other Attorney General's office, and in particular across the market, other boards of directors took note of that. And it's going to affect the way they're going to think about their relationships with their investors. So even a little bit of change in one place like that, it's a big company, they're tough, I know, but sending a message to that board sends a message to every board that has its fingertips on the levers of our environmental future. So keep an eye on that case, it's extremely important.
Thank you. Over here.
Andrea Hamilton with First Affirmative. And this is said entirely seriously, I'm not being sarcastic. How did a guy like you get appointed by Trump?
Good question. Look.
People may know not how the process works.
Yeah, so just to say a little bit about it, I mean, I was the Senate Democrats' choice for the role. At a bipartisan commission, the president tends to ask Senate Democrats what they think about it, and I was very, very fortunate that the leaders of the Senate thought that I'd be good for the job. If I'm being totally honest with you, and what I want to say in answer to your question is if you're wondering whether I had some pause about it, I did. And in the end, what persuaded me is, because the last time I was in government, it was the first term of the Obama administration. I was in the Obama Treasury in 2009, 2010. Let me just say, different experience. But here's the way I think about it. It's at a moment like this, I think, actually, where you make the biggest difference. Where you have the opportunity to not just stop bad things from happening, but to set the agenda for the future, to set a different agenda. And that's why I was so excited to come here and talk to all of you. Because I know it feels like at a moment like this that the marginal gains are actually less than they might be at a different moment, but I think that turns out to be wrong. I think it's at a moment like this where the messages that you send, not just to guys like me or to the community here, but to the nation, to the world, it turns out that it's loudest at a moment like this one. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, but I have to tell you, what you guys are doing right now is so important, and I urge you to keep at it.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, next question.
All right, my name is Jordan Kuntz. I'm a advisor at a registered investment advisor here in Colorado, but also a director for CFA Society Colorado, and I'm curious that you've come in partway through the process. I know it's still ongoing, so you might not be able to comment exactly on where you see it going, but the process on the best interest rules and the fiduciary rule, just in general for the advisors in the office or in the room today, how that's been for you coming in through partway on a very long and drawn out process.
Sure.
And what the outlook is. I think is it September of next year that's potentially going to be finalized?
Sure. So I should say a little bit about this just for, so there's been a long debate in Washington over the last really 20 or 30 years about what the standards of conduct should be for broker-dealers as opposed to investment advisors. Investment advisors are subject to the 1940 Act, which imposes all kinds of obligations when they give advice to ordinary Americans. Broker-dealers have very few clear standards, and the ones that they do, the suitability standard has not protected a lot of investors from harm. When I joined the SEC, the chairman had made clear that he wanted to push this forward, that he wanted to do a standard of conduct. And at the same time, the Department of Labor made clear that it wasn't going to enforce the DOL rule that was adopted in the Obama administration. And I should also add that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals vacated most of that rule, and so put us in a place where really investors had no protection. We proposed the rule a few months ago, and I have to say I was very troubled by the nature of the proposal, but I voted for it, and I want to say why. To me, the SEC has to be in this space because the Department of Labor only regulates retirement assets. And so for us to have two different, the whole point here is for investors to have the protections they're entitled to when they walk into that office. And the idea that we'd have a different rule depending on whether that office invests retirement assets or is just an ordinary account made little sense to me. So I thought the SEC should be in the space. To the chairman's great credit, we've gone on a listening tour around the country. I've met with individual investors across the United States, asking them what they need when they go to that office. At the end of the day, it's actually not that complicated. In Dodd-Frank, the Congress laid out a standard, which is fundamentally a standard that requires the broker to have a fiduciary duty to their client. And it's actually not that complicated. Do the right thing when it comes to your client. Rather than try and make money or make decisions based on your own profit incentives, make the one that's best for the person in front of you. I don't know whether we're going to get there in this administration, but I certainly hope so. And I'll say just one more thing about it. Unfortunately, I think to the degree that we do something on a partisan basis, what we're going to do is end up with lots of litigation. Because I can tell you right now, the advocates who have spent their careers trying to develop the right protections for investors are not going to stand by while we weaken them. Right. They're going to litigate, and it's fully their right. I'm hoping that we can get there in a bipartisan resolution of this, because at the end of the day, if we litigate for another 5 years, that pays lobbyists and lawyers, and it's good for them, but not investors. And it's time. Dodd-Frank is 8 years old. It's time for American investors to know that when they walk into a broker's office, they're going to get a fair shake. And I'm hoping to be a part of that process.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, Michael Kramer, Natural Investments, and I'm a USIF board member. Lisa and Jonas and I had the privilege with some other board members of meeting with Chairman Clayton some months ago to share our perspective, and he was a difficult read in terms of his level of support, and I'm being tactful. So my question to you is, these votes are often 3-2. We're very well aware of that. Who should we be working on the other side? Like, who should we be targeting? Because it's really difficult to know where there might be some degree of sympathy. And if there is any on the other side, what are the core inroads there? Like, what are the key sympathetic points we could bring up that could create some favor for the kinds of issues that we stand for as you read the other commissioners? Where is the opportunity there?
Thanks, Michael. So I might be able to say, I mean, I certainly was part of that meeting, and I've been part of other meetings with Clayton and then Hinman, who's head of corporate finance, and they work very, very closely together. And I mean, I've been pleasantly surprised at the lack of ideological perspective that they approach this community with, and an openness, but also pretty accessible. I mean, I think I've met with this chairman more than probably the last 3 chair people altogether. So that's my overall impression. I think where the rubber's going to meet the road is when something comes up that's really important to us. How does that decision get made? But you have a better read on that, I think.
Yeah, I agree with everything. I mean, look, to be perfectly candid, I think you can say lots of things about the chairman, but I think you can't say that he's not responsive, that he won't listen to your argument. Whether you win is a different kettle of fish, and that was the second part of your question, and I plan to say something about that. But first, just let's be clear, if you want to talk to him about the issues that are important to you, he will take that meeting, is my experience. He'll listen, he'll ask skeptical questions, that's what lawyers do, but he'll push you on your assumptions. Again, that's what lawyers do, but he'll listen to you. And I think that's a really important starting point because I really get the strong sense that he hasn't made up his mind in any particular case. So the answer to your question is your best bet is certainly with him. And the way to persuade him is to frame the issue from the perspective of retail investors. And look, I'll say something else about Jay. I've been working with him for 10 months. The number of lies he's told me is 0. He's straightforward. When I'm gonna win, he tells me. When I'm gonna lose, he tells me. I'm gonna lose a lot often than I'm gonna win, he tells me that too. And on this, he's been very clear. From the day he was nominated, he said, we need to get back to the nuts and bolts of Mr. and Mrs. 401k. We have to protect American investors and make sure they're getting a fair shake. And I think arguments that are framed like that, in my experience, tend to persuade him, and arguments that aren't don't. I also want to say one more thing. My confirmation colleague, Hester Peirce, has put out some views that I think suggest that it would be difficult to persuade her. My other new Republican colleague, Elad Roisman, hasn't done that. And that's a meeting worth taking. He seems to me enormously thoughtful. He's worked on Senate banking for many years. I don't know what his views are going to be on these subjects, but again, he strikes me as an open-minded guy. In that case, I would think that arguments from the market, telling him, look, this is important to investors, man. There's billions and billions of dollars that are getting invested on an ESG basis. I think that might be something that might persuade him. And again, I think you'll find he'll take the meeting. He wants to have the conversation, and I urge you to get in the room.
Thanks.
Just
I
one,
see. Go on, Lisa.
well, just one additional point on that, on Commissioner Roisman. So when he was on the Senate Banking Committee, we found him very susceptible to bipartisan arguments. So if you can go in and frame something in that way, I think that's also helpful, in addition to being very data-driven. So hopefully there is some openness there.
Yeah.
Great. Question over here.
Thanks. Adam Dolan with the Global Impact Investing Network. This might be a question for Lisa, but for any of you really. I was wondering if the recent bill that established the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation surprised any of you given the current political climate?
I'm actually not familiar with it.
Yeah, so there's OPIC used to be this agency. None of you have heard about this?
No.
There's a New York Times article. I don't know. Anyway,
You
I'll read
send it to us.
If you don't mind, I can read the opening paragraph.
Maybe just give us like a 2 lines about what it is.
Okay, yeah. So a recent bill just established the United States International Development Finance Corporation and gave it the authority to provide $60 billion in loans, loan guarantees, and insurance to companies willing to do business in developing nations.
Okay.
It's basically replacing an existing international development agency with this one and giving it more leeway with different financial structures.
Okay.
But
All right. Sorry we don't have an opinion on that. It's so rare we don't have an opinion on something. So, yeah. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Anyone in the back? All right. Well, with that, I want to really thank all of my panelists who came here today for this. And I think everyone's going to be around for dinner. So if you want to continue the conversation with anybody, feel free to do so. And see you all later. Thank you.
Thank you so much.